The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the suburban New Jersey home that David and Amanda Reed had shared for a decade. Their life together had the hallmarks of stability: a comfortable house, two vibrant children, a shared history of triumphs and struggles, and the unspoken routines of long-term marriage. To outsiders, theirs was an enviable union, marked by quiet contentment and mutual respect. But beneath the surface, David harbored doubts that he could no longer suppress. The couple's two children, Ethan and Sophie, were their pride and joy. Ethan, at 8, was a precocious boy with a penchant for building elaborate Lego structures, while Sophie, just 5, was a bundle of curiosity and giggles, constantly peppering her parents with questions. David loved them with a fierce devotion, but in the past year, something had begun to gnaw at him, a shadow of uncertainty that made him question the very foundation of his family. The Reeds were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary that evening, an event David had taken great care to orchestrate. In a gesture of love and nostalgia, he had planned a gathering of their closest friends and family at their home. The event was meant to honor Amanda, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. But David's preparations carried an undertone of dread, a gnawing tension that had been building for months. Amanda was the picture of grace and charm, effortlessly mingling with their guests as the party began. She wore the same warmth that had drawn David to her when they met at a college mixer years ago. Her laughter rang through the air as she recounted stories of their early years together, and their guests laughed along, enthralled by her vivid storytelling. But as David watched her from across the room, a mix of emotions churned within him. He recalled the day he had found a half-written text message on her phone, a moment that sparked the seed of doubt. The message had been quickly deleted, and Amanda had brushed it off, but the image stayed burned into his memory. She'd grown increasingly distracted in the months since, longer work hours, more solo outings under the guise of errands, and a sudden obsession with yoga classes that David had never seen her take seriously before. Each change seemed innocuous on its own, but together, they painted a picture that David couldn't ignore. For weeks, David had considered confronting Amanda, but something always held him back. He told himself it was for the children's sake, for the life they had built, for the memories they had shared. But in truth, he was scared of the answers he might receive, scared of confirming his worst fears. Then came the phone call that would change everything. A private investigator David had reluctantly hired to allay, or confirm, his suspicions had called him just 2 days earlier. The man's voice was steady but tinged with sympathy as he delivered his findings. The photographs, the logs, the surveillance footage, it was all there, damning and undeniable. Amanda had been unfaithful, and the timeline suggested a long-standing betrayal. David's world crumbled in that moment. He thought of Ethan and Sophie, of the life he had fought to provide for them. He thought of Amanda's smile and the years they had shared. And then he thought of the DNA test he had taken on a hunch, a test whose results sat unopened in the drawer of his office desk. With trembling hands, David had opened the envelope the night before the party. The words were clinical, emotionless, a stark contrast to the upheaval they unleashed within him. Neither Ethan nor Sophie was his biological child. Now, as the anniversary party unfolded, David moved through the room with a calm exterior, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. But inside, a storm brewed. The finality of what he was about to do filled him with equal parts dread and determination. Tonight, he would confront Amanda. In the presence of those who had been witnesses to their life together, he would lay bare the truth. As the evening wore on, David gathered the group in the living room, raising a glass to toast their decade of marriage. Amanda beamed, her cheeks flushed with happiness, as she held his hand. Their friends and family applauded, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension in David's voice as he spoke. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating our time together," David began, his tone steady but tinged with gravity. "It's also about truth, about recognizing the foundation of love and trust on which a marriage is built." The room quieted, sensing the shift in mood. Amanda glanced at him, her smile faltering as his words took on a more serious tone. David placed the glass on the coffee table and pulled out a manila envelope. "Amanda," he said, locking eyes with her, "I want to share something with you. Something that has been weighing on my heart." The room fell into a heavy silence as David held the envelope in his hands. Amanda's smile froze, her eyes darting from the envelope to his face, searching for clues to his intention. The warmth of the celebration dimmed, replaced by an air of unease among their gathered friends and family. Even the children, playing nearby with their cousins, seemed to pick up on the tension, their laughter fading as they glanced toward the adults. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Before we continue celebrating tonight," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I need to address something important. Something Amanda and I need to confront together." Amanda shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. "David, what's this about?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervous laughter, an attempt to diffuse the atmosphere. "This is supposed to be a happy occasion." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the envelope and pulled out its contents, a neatly folded set of papers and a smaller envelope, sealed and marked, DNA results. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the coffee table in front of him, the weight of what he was about to say threatening to buckle his resolve. "Amanda," he said finally, looking directly into her eyes, "I've spent weeks wrestling with doubts, trying to understand what's been happening to us. And I had hoped, prayed, that those doubts were unfounded. But I couldn't ignore the signs anymore." Amanda's face paled. Her hands clutched the edge of her chair as if anchoring herself against an invisible tide. "What are you talking about, David? What signs?" David glanced around the room. Their guests sat in stunned silence, watching the drama unfold as though it were a scene from a play. His voice softened, almost apologetic. "You've been distant, Amanda. Different. I've noticed the late nights, the sudden hobbies, the secrecy. I tried to brush it off, but it became impossible to ignore." Amanda's lips parted as though to protest, but no words came. David pressed on, his voice growing firmer. "I hired someone to look into it. A private investigator." Gasps rippled through the room, and Amanda's eyes widened, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. "I wanted to be wrong," he continued, his tone heavy with regret. "But I wasn't." What did you do?" Amanda asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her hands trembled now, mirroring David's own. David reached for the stack of papers. "I found out the truth, Amanda. About your affair. About the lies you've been telling me. And about the children." The words landed like a thunderclap. Amanda's expression morphed from shock to panic as she shook her head vehemently. No, David, you've got it all wrong," she stammered. "I would never." "Stop." David's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through her denial. He slammed the DNA results onto the coffee table, the sound echoing in the silence. "Don't lie to me. Not tonight." Tears welled in Amanda's eyes as her family and friends watched in stunned disbelief. "David, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I can explain." David didn't flinch. "Explain what, Amanda? The late-night phone calls? The weekends you claimed to be at work? Or should I talk about the man I saw you with in those photographs?" His words were relentless, each one stripping away the facade she had worked so hard to maintain. Amanda's tears spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands, her sobs racking her body. The room was utterly still, the weight of her guilt hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Finally, she looked up, her face streaked with tears. "David," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lost, I was lonely." David's expression hardened. "Lost? Lonely? And how does that justify this?" He gestured toward the DNA test. "How does that explain why the children I've loved and raised as my own, aren't mine?" Amanda's sobs deepened, her voice barely audible as she tried to form words. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought it was a mistake, that I could move past it. I didn't want to destroy our family." David stood, his frame towering over her as he struggled to contain the storm of emotions threatening to consume him. His voice, though soft, carried a razor's edge. "You already destroyed it, Amanda. And now, we have to live with the consequences." He reached for the final piece of evidence, a USB drive he'd retrieved from the private investigator. "There's more," he said, his voice trembling now. "And I think you'll want to see it." He moved to the television in the corner of the room and inserted the USB drive. The guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they should stay or leave. Amanda's face crumpled as the screen lit up, and a series of videos began to play. It was footage of her and another man, moments that should have been private, now exposed for all to see. Amanda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. No, she cried, shaking her head as though denial could erase the images. David, please stop this. Even Amanda's pleas couldn't halt the march of evidence. The room remained silent except for the muffled sound of the videos. A collective tension filled the space as the once celebratory atmosphere shattered into fragments. When the screen went dark, David turned to face his wife. Her sobs echoed in the quiet, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, he felt a pang of empathy for her pain, but it was quickly overshadowed by his own anguish. This isn't just about me, David said quietly. It's about our children. About the lies they'll have to uncover someday. And it's about the man I've become, someone I no longer recognize because of you. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Amanda's sobs filled the room, raw and unrestrained. Her shoulders shook violently as the magnitude of David's revelations bore down on her. Around them, their friends and family remained frozen, unsure of whether to leave or stay. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others looked away entirely, as if turning their heads could make the scene less real. David let the silence linger for a moment longer, letting the weight of his words settle. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a deep breath as he prepared to continue. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, tinged with a sadness that pierced through the tension. Amanda, he said, I loved you. I gave you everything I had, my trust, my heart, my loyalty. And this is what you've given me in return. He gestured toward the DNA results on the coffee table, then at the now dark television. His hand dropped to his side, as though the weight of the betrayal had left him too drained to carry it. Amanda looked up at him, her tear-streaked face desperate. David, I was wrong, she choked out. I made a mistake, but I swear, it wasn't about not loving you. I do love you, always have. I was weak, and I didn't think. You didn't think, David interrupted, his tone colder now. You didn't think about me. About Ethan. About Sophie. You didn't think about the life we built together. And you didn't think about what would happen when the truth came out. He turned to the room, addressing their stunned guests. I brought you all here tonight because I wanted to celebrate our anniversary. I wanted to honor the woman I thought Amanda was, and the life I thought we had. But it seems I've been living a lie. David, please. Amanda cried, reaching for his hand. He stepped back, the gesture cutting through her like a blade. I've spent weeks trying to find a way to forgive you, Amanda, he said, his voice trembling now. But the truth is, forgiveness isn't something I can just will myself to feel. You've not only betrayed me but also robbed me of the foundation of trust one thought our family was built on. He took another step back, his gaze sweeping the room. To everyone here, he said, addressing the stunned crowd, I'm sorry you had to witness this. But I won't keep pretending everything is fine. I refuse to keep lying, to myself, to my children, or to any of you. Amanda's mother, Linda, broke the tense silence. David, wait, she said, her voice quavering. Isn't there some way to salvage this? For the children, at least. David turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Linda, he said, I've thought of nothing else. But the truth is, even if I stay, even if I try to pretend, this marriage will never be the same. And Ethan and Sophie, they deserve to grow up in a home built on love and truth, not resentment and betrayal. The room was heavy with the weight of his words. Amanda buried her face in her hands again, her sobs muffled now. Ethan and Sophie, sensing something was wrong, wandered hesitantly into the room. Their wide eyes scanned the scene, confused by the tears and the tension. Daddy? Sophie asked, clutching a stuffed bunny tightly to her chest. Why is Mommy crying? David crouched down to their level, forcing a smile through his anguish. Come here, sweetheart, he said gently, opening his arms. Both children rushed to him, and he enveloped them in a tight embrace. Everything's going to be okay, I promise, he murmured, though his voice cracked under the weight of the promise. Are you and Mommy mad at each other? Ethan asked, his brow furrowed with concern. David kissed the top of his son's head. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work through, he said carefully. But I want you to remember something very important. No matter what happens, Mommy and I love you both more than anything in the world. That will never, ever change. The children nodded, their young minds struggling to process the moment. David stood, holding Ethan and Sophie's hands as he turned back to the room. His voice was firmer now, the clarity of his decision giving him strength. "I've made arrangements," he said. "Amanda, I'll be moving out tomorrow. I've already contacted a lawyer to handle the divorce proceedings. As for the children," he paused, looking down at them with a mixture of love and heartbreak. "I'll always be there for them, no matter what." Amanda let out a wail, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. "David, no," she cried. "You can't just walk away like this. We can fix this, we have to fix this." David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The time to fix this, Amanda, was before it ever got to this point." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leading Ethan and Sophie to the playroom where they could escape the intensity of the moment. As the door closed behind him, Amanda collapsed onto the couch, her cries echoing in the stunned silence of the room. The days following the anniversary party were a blur of logistical arrangements, emotional breakdowns, and difficult conversations. David moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town, leaving behind the family home he had worked so hard to build. The silence of his new living space was deafening, a stark contrast to the lively chaos he'd left behind. For Amanda, the aftermath was unbearable. The once bustling house now felt hollow without David's presence. The weight of her actions hung over her like a storm cloud. Each time she looked at Ethan and Sophie, guilt stabbed at her, sharper than any words David had spoken. Her children were innocent, caught in the fallout of decisions they had no hand in. In his apartment, David began the painstaking process of rebuilding. He poured himself into work, taking on extra projects at the firm where he worked as an architect. Colleagues noticed his newfound intensity, but they chalked it up to ambition. No one suspected the emotional turmoil driving him to fill his days with activity. Evenings were the hardest. David would sit in his small living room, staring at the photos he had brought from the house. The smiling faces of Ethan and Sophie, captured in moments of pure joy, now felt like bittersweet reminders of what he had lost. Despite the pain, he made a point of seeing them every weekend. Those visits became his lifeline, a brief respite from the weight of betrayal. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Sophie asked during one visit, her big eyes brimming with confusion. David knelt to her level, brushing her hair gently. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "Daddy has a new home now, but I'm always just a phone call away. And I'll see you and Ethan as much as I can, okay?" Her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, and he held her close, blinking back tears. Moments like these made the pain of separation worth enduring, even if the ache in his chest never fully subsided. For Amanda, the weeks that followed were filled with regret and self-reflection. Desperate to understand her choices, she sought therapy. Her therapist didn't let her off the hook easily. "You can't undo what's done," the therapist said firmly. "But you can take steps to rebuild trust. Not just with David, but with yourself. And more importantly, you need to focus on the children. They need stability now more than ever." Amanda took the advice to heart. She stopped taking the yoga classes that had served as a cover for her deceit and cut off all contact with the man who had been the catalyst for her undoing. She threw herself into her role as a mother, trying to create a sense of normalcy for Ethan and Sophie, even as the cracks in her family loomed large. Months passed, and David found himself slowly settling into his new routine. One Saturday, he took Ethan and Sophie to a local park. They spent hours playing on the swings and climbing the jungle gym, their laughter a soothing balm to his weary heart. As they were leaving, David nearly collided with a woman carrying a stack of books. She looked up, startled, and then smiled. "David?" she asked. "David Reed?" David blinked, recognition dawning. "Rachel?" Rachel Lawson had been a college friend, someone David hadn't seen in years. They exchanged pleasantries, and Rachel explained that she had recently moved back to town after living in California for a decade. She was a single mother herself, raising a 6-year-old daughter, and their shared experiences gave them plenty to talk about. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and David reconnected. Their friendship rekindled easily, and while David wasn't ready to entertain the idea of a romantic relationship, he found comfort in Rachel's understanding presence. She didn't pry, didn't push, she simply listened when he needed to talk and made him laugh when he thought he'd forgotten how. Ethan and Sophie began to ask harder questions as time went on. Why don't you and Mommy live together anymore? Ethan asked one evening as David helped him with homework. David hesitated, searching for the right words. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt each other, he said carefully. And when that happens, it's better for them to live apart so they can be better parents for their kids. But you and Mommy still love us, right? Sophie chimed in, her voice small. David pulled them both into a hug. More than anything in the world, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That will never, ever change. One evening, as David prepared dinner in his apartment, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Amanda standing there, her face pale and drawn. David, she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you. David didn't say anything at first, merely stepping aside to let her in. She stood in the small living room, looking out of place in her tailored coat and polished heels. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. I've been working on myself, she said quietly. I know I can never undo the hurt I've caused, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. David crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Amanda, it's good that you're taking responsibility. But an apology doesn't fix what's broken. I know, Amanda said, her voice cracking. But I want to try. For the kids. For us. I know it's too late for me to ask for your forgiveness, but maybe we could start over. David stared at her, the weight of her words hanging heavily between them. David stared at Amanda, her words hanging in the air like a fragile truce. The room was still except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second amplifying the tension. Amanda's eyes brimmed with desperation, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though she were praying for a miracle. For a moment, David said nothing. His gaze softened briefly as he looked at the woman who had once been his everything, the woman who had stood beside him at the altar and promised forever. But forever had been broken, and no amount of words could repair the cracks that betrayal had carved into his heart. Amanda, he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, I don't doubt that you're sorry. I don't doubt that you regret what you've done. But regret doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rebuild the trust that's been shattered. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. David, please, I'll do anything. I've changed. I'll keep changing. I just need a chance to prove it to you, to show you that we can still be a family. David took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right words. A family, he echoed, his voice tinged with bitterness. Amanda, do you know how many times I've looked at Ethan and Sophie and wondered what kind of man I'd be if I walked away from them? If I let your choices define who I am? Amanda opened her mouth to respond, but David held up a hand, stopping her. The truth is, I won't let that happen. I won't let this destroy the love I have for them. I will always be their father in every way that matters, even if I'm not the one who gave them life. Tears streamed down Amanda's face as she reached for him. Then why can't we try? For them? For us? David stepped back, putting space between them. Because love isn't enough, Amanda. Not anymore. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and without it, love can't survive. You made your choices, and I've made mine. I've chosen to walk away. Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. David felt a pang of guilt, but it was overshadowed by the clarity of his decision. He couldn't stay trapped in a cycle of betrayal and forgiveness that would erode whatever was left of his dignity. He crouched beside her, his voice soft but firm. You're a good mother, Amanda. I see it in how much you love Ethan and Sophie. They need you to be strong for them now, just like I need to be strong for myself. She lifted her tear-streaked face, searching his eyes for any hint of doubt. But all she found was resolve. Is this really it? She whispered. After everything we've been through? David nodded slowly. Yes. This is it. Amanda sobbed harder, but David didn't waver. He stood and walked to the door, opening it. Good night, Amanda, he said gently. For a moment, she didn't move, staring at him as though willing him to change his mind. But when it became clear that he wouldn't, she rose on unsteady legs and walked to the door. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she turned back to him one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I know, David replied, his expression unreadable. Goodbye, Amanda. He closed the doors softly behind her and stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. His heart felt heavy, but for the first time in months, there was also a sense of release, a weight lifting as he let go of the past. The next day, David took Ethan and Sophie to the park, where they laughed and played as though nothing had changed. Watching them, he felt a sense of purpose that steadied him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: his love for his children would guide him forward, no matter how difficult the road ahead. Later that evening, as he tucked the kids into bed in his small apartment, Sophie looked up at him with her wide, innocent eyes. Daddy, she said, her voice sleepy, are you happy? David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm getting there, sweetheart, he said. One day at a time. As the children drifted off to sleep, David sat in the quiet of his apartment, feeling a mix of pain and hope. He thought of Rachel, of the gentle laughter they had shared in recent weeks, and wondered if perhaps life was offering him a second chance at happiness. Outside, the night was calm, the stars bright against the velvet sky. And for the first time in a long time, David felt a flicker of peace. What would you do in David's shoes? Can trust ever be rebuilt after such betrayal? Share your thoughts and let's discuss.